Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Brian. In today's video we're going to be talking about making a bookshelf. The bookshelf that I'm going to be making started out with an idea and a rough sketch. You can see with the picture on your screen a rough sketch of the bookshelf that I had in mind. I usually start with something like that. Once I have a hand-drawn drawing, I go through and I put in dimensions, and I make sure that I add dimensions for joinery so that the way in which I'm going to connect every piece accounts for the fact whether I'm adding a mortise and tenon joint or something like that. We're going to start by making the sides. The sides have two vertical legs or stiles that are a part of our bookcase. These are 8/4 inch thick or 2 inches. In addition to that, we have two horizontal rails, and finally we have two vertical spindles that go in the middle of our bookshelf that help keep the books from falling off the shelf, which is kind of nice. In this picture you'll see a view of the front, and you're going to see a horizontal rail at the bottom and a horizontal rail at the top. The horizontal rail at the bottom is a little bit wider than one at the top because I wanted to draw your eye or make it have the appearance that the bottom is heavier than the top. In addition, we have a shelf at the bottom and two shelves in the middle and a top going all the way across and extending over by about 3/4 of an inch to have a little bit of overhang.
So I started off by cutting the legs from a 2-inch thick piece of material. So I made the legs square, and as you can see, my table saw will only cut 1 7/8 of an inch and not 2 inches. So then I had to use a rip saw to cut through the remaining material. I next used a combination of the card scraper and a hand plane to clean up all the mill marks that are on the side and also the burn marks that showed up. Here I'm taking my time and trying to get or clean up all 4 sides. I was actually really enjoying using my hand plane here. My hand plane was generating very thin shavings, and I could see the mill marks fade away as I took my time to plane the rest of the surfaces. To help you capture this moment, we have turned the camera so we can see the thin shavings fall into the ground. We then reset our camera and finish up the rest of the leg. I used the same process for on all 4 legs before starting to lay out the joinery on each of the legs. I next looked at the legs and decided which faces of the legs should be facing outward and which ones should be facing inward. And then I marked the right front, the right back, the left front, and the left back on the top of each leg. To elaborate, this marking helps me prevent me from making mistakes whenever I go to create the mortises on each of the sides of the legs. I need to make mortises on the top and bottom, on the inside face, and also on the faces that connect the sides. I tried to show you this in the video, but it's awfully difficult to see. But what I'm doing here, in addition to labeling the right front, the right back, the left front, and the left back, is that I'm drawing arrows to the inside faces and to the faces of the legs that connect the sides. After marking that last leg, I noticed that there were some imperfections, and I decided to use the hand plane to fix them. I'm now starting to lay out the locations of the mortises. Here I'm using a simple marking gauge to mark the center of each leg. I also use the width of the horizontal rails to mark that on the legs so I know how far to go with the mortises. To make this process a little faster, what I do is I clamp the pieces together. I also use a square, and I transfer the measurements from one leg over to the measurements on another leg. And then I do the same for the legs on the other side. In theory, this gives me identical marks on the front and back legs for each side, showing where each of the horizontal rails should meet. So we'll see how this theory pans out in practice when it comes time to assemble the entire bookshelf. We'll now start laying out the tenons on the horizontal rails. Here I'm using a marking gauge to lay out 3/4 inch long tenons. I then start to mark the locations on the horizontal rails where the vertical spindles will meet. When doing this, I realized that I'm going to have to cut a total of 16 tenons. And since I have a deadline for this project, I decide to go a different direction and decide to use a loose tenon, which will allow me to use my Festool Domino. So I lay out the center line for the spindles, and then I go back to the leg. Once I return to the legs, I need to lay out the locations or the center lines for the mortises that will be made. And now I'm going to be making mortises in both the horizontal rails and the legs, and then I'll be using a loose tenon to connect them. I should point out here that I'm taking advantage of the fact that I carefully laid out the markings on 2 of the legs, and then what I do is I go about transferring those marks to the other legs. My hope is that this will allow me to create more accurate mortises so that when I insert the loose tenons, everything will line up correctly. Perhaps another thing I should mention here is that I'm going to use the Festool corner connectors that will allow me to connect the sides to the front and the back, and this will allow me to take it apart and ship it in a more compact form. After finishing making the center line marks, my next step is to break out the Festool Domino and adjust the height setting so I'm at the center line for each of the legs. Another thing I need to consider is that I'm using the 8mm domino bit. I'm using this because it creates a stronger connection than the smaller domino bits. I then make the mortises in each of the legs one at a time. I start by clamping the leg to the MFT table with the ratcheting clamps, and then I go on each side, find those center lines, and I create the mortise. These are the mortises that are going to be used to connect with the horizontal rails and make the sides. Since I have 4 legs, I have to do this on both sides, the top and the bottom of each of my legs, until I've completed all 8 mortises. But you will see this is a rather quick process. And another thing I like about using this tool is that there's almost no dust that gets created or gets thrown up into the atmosphere. It's almost all collected by the dust extractor tool. Certainly something I need to point out is that I made the mortises wider than they needed to be. I did this because I was still considering hand cutting the tenons on the horizontal rails. So what I later did off camera is that I cut a domino in half, and then I used that to fill the slots or the extra space that was beyond the width of a normal domino. As you will see, this seemed to work pretty well, and you probably wouldn't even notice it had I not mentioned it. Since I allowed extra room for the tenons on my horizontal rails, this means I now need to trim those by 1.5 inches, since I had 2 3/4 inch tenons on each end. So here you can see me using the table saw, and I'm trimming the ends off of each of my horizontal rails. Now that I've cut each of the horizontal rails to length, it's time to return to the MFT table and make the mortises with the Festool Domino. So what you see is me making the mortises on the ends of the horizontal rails, and then I'll flip them over and do the other side. I do this before switching my bit to a 6mm bit, and then I make the mortises for each of the vertical spindles on the inside faces of the horizontal rail. Again, the easy thing to do is to mark everything on one piece and then transfer the measurements. I then grab the vertical spindles and make the mortises on the bottom of each of those. I then put the sides together by joining the legs and the horizontal rails. This allows me to cut to length or to measure the exact length that is needed for each of the vertical spindles rather than cut that ahead of time. And just for fun, I break out the magnetic saw guide and then I cut each of my vertical spindles to length. I can now make the mortises on the top and put together each of the sides. Here you get a first look at one of the sides, and here this is a dry fit and I haven't used any glue yet. Now start the process of assembling the sides, and there's a correct order for this. Dry assembly taught me that it's a lot easier to assemble the spindles first and then to connect it with the sides. So I applied the dominoes and the glue to the center spindles, and then I went about assembling the sides. Sometimes it's helpful to use a longer clamp to draw the horizontal rails and the center and those vertical spindles together. But once I've drawn these pieces together, I can take that clamp off and then just use clamps to connect the legs to the horizontal rails. And here we show you a quick look at the assembled side before we start to assemble the other side. And I follow the same process by connecting the vertical spindles together with the horizontal rails, and then I follow up by using some clamps to pull everything together, and this completes the building of the sides. So I set them aside and start to work on the top, bottom, and 2 horizontal shelves in the middle. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut some panel sections to rough length. But before gluing the panels together, I grab my bench plane or my smoothing plane and make sure that I have 2 good edges to come together. I also use my square to make sure the edges are square to the face of the board. I've now grabbed the next board, and I'm using the bench plane again to smooth the edge. My goal is to get rid of the mill marks, but in addition to create a flat surface. So I make several passes with my hand plane, and then I go back and I check with my square again. Once I'm satisfied, then I check the fit of the 2 panels together. The end goal is to create a nice seam along the edge where the 2 panels meet. Once I think that it looks pretty good, then I move on. I then select a new board and I start to cut the next panel. After I have both pieces cut, then I grab my clamps and then I start to glue the 2 pieces together. Here I'm using a simple butt joint to glue the 2 pieces together. So I just apply glue and then put the clamps on. Then I'll have to set the panel aside and let it dry overnight. But while I'm here, I'll go ahead and glue my other panel together. This next piece that I'm gluing together is the top. I once again use a butt joint and some bar clamps, put the two pieces together, and then I set them aside for the next day. So the next day I came back and took each of the panels out of the bar clamps, and then what I did is I took them to the table saw and I first cleaned up one of the two edges. One of the interesting things about the Festool table saw is that you can use a clamp along with the sliding table. So I found this handy for these relatively long panels in this small table saw. It enabled me to get nice square cut along the entire length of the ends. For the bookshelf top that you see here, you have to use a little creativity in that the distance between the saw blade and the rip fence is not wide enough to cut the top to width. So what I have to do is I have to just remove the waist section. This leaves behind the good piece that I want to keep to make the top. So after getting the top to be the width that I wanted, I also need to clean up one of the edges. And then what I need to do is I need to cut each of the 4 panels to their final lengths, which is what you see me doing now. Once again, that ratcheting clamp on this sliding table works really well to help hold a panel down. Here you can see me finishing up and cutting the panels before I start on the pieces that go on the front and the back. So in this next segment of video, you see me trying to cut the top and bottom rails that go in the front and the back. However, during the middle of the cutting process, the batteries die, and this is the problem with having a battery-powered table saw. Fortunately, my table saw does not have a plug-in backup, so what I had to do was take a break and recharge the batteries. Once the battery is recharged, we come back and we flip the workpiece over and we cut the rest of that piece. Then I proceed to cut the horizontal rails on the top and the bottom for both the front and the back. After cutting each of these to width, I then need to cut them to length. So what I do is I first cut one edge to make it clean, and then I align the two work pieces that go on the top and bottom in both the front and the back, and then I cut them to length by clamping them together and also using the ratcheting clamp so that it helps me hold these down and keep them square on the work table. Now that the horizontal rails for the top and the bottom and the front and the back are all cut, I can take them over to the MFT table and create the mortises that I need to connect them with the side. I'm using the 8mm bit and I'm creating mortises on each of the workpieces, and then I'm going to flip them over and create the same mortise on the opposite sides. But since I'm going to use the corner connectors, there's an extra step involved here. Here I need to drill a hole in each of the ends of the workpieces using the jig that's provided by the Domino connector kit. This allows me to insert the knockdown hardware that will allow me to connect the horizontal rails on the top and bottom to each of the sides. I'm now starting to feel the excitement of a project coming together. Installing the hardware or the knockdown hardware on the sides, the Domino connector hardware. Those little tombstones that stick up, they have a little indentation in them, and whenever you take the horizontal pieces and you connect them with those, it helps draw the two pieces together. I did an entire video on those Domino connectors, and I've used those on a couple pieces of furniture now. I find that they're a pretty good solution, except for the fact that unlike a domino, those little tombstones allow the workpiece to spin, so you might have to put more than one, or you have to have some way to constrain the workpiece from spinning. The next step after assembling all this knockdown hardware is to do a dry fit of the entire frame. So I put the entire frame together, and I also put the top and the bottom shelf on it. I then think to myself, I think it looks pretty good, but the panels need to be cleaned up. I started with the chisel plane to remove the glue. This was followed by a smoothing plane and a cabinet scraper. I'm mostly using the cabinet scraper to remove glue here, and not so much anything else. The smoothing plane is doing a lot of the work. I'm also using the jig that I recently made to use on my MFT table for planing a surface. You can see that the panels that I'm planing are actually much bigger than my jig, and so I might need to make a bigger jig. So I finish up one panel before I go to the next. The overall goal is to flatten these panels and to use strokes at 45-degree angles and also along the length of the panel. While this process of flattening the panels may take a little bit longer than some would like, well, you know what? It's actually pretty good exercise as well. And apparently we could all use more of that. I'm now in that stage of final surface prep. I go through it and I sand it, I remove burn marks, and I'm trying to get the overall project to be ready for assembly. I also end up using the card scraper on the top to remove the glue and the smoothing plane. As a part of the final surface prep, I grabbed my bird's eye jig that I made for my MFT table. I used the bird's eye jig to joint the edges, and here you can see some burn marks. Still yet another thing to do is to sand the inside and outside of the sides, all the way around each of the legs and also the spindles. Here I kind of regret not sanding the sides of the spindles while I still had everything apart. So, if you make this bookshelf, I recommend that you do that, otherwise you'll end up hand sanding those, because it's difficult to fit the sander in between the legs and the spindles. One thing that I have not done yet is I have not cleaned up the edges on each of the panels. So I grabbed my smoothing plane and I use that to clean up each of the edges. Because the edges are still sharp, I also use a block plane. I use that to give the edges a slight round over, or to break the sharpness of the edge. I'm now drilling holes for the 1/4" shelf pin. That red depth stop on my 1/4" drill bit is used to make sure I don't drill too deep. Before turning on the camera, I took the time to lay out each of the 6 holes that are going to be drilled on the leg. This required me to measure out the locations of the holes, and I then transferred those from one leg to another leg with a square. So I first drilled the holes in one of the 2 sides, and then I drilled the holes on the remaining side. I now start the process of final assembly. For some reason I thought this process would be much simpler if I did this with everything upside down. While I'm not sure that was the case, it still seemed to work out alright. What you see me doing is putting the top on the workbench, and then I put the sides on top of the top, and then afterwards I connect each of the sides with the top and bottom horizontal rails. By tightening the Allen screw and the domino connectors, this pulls the sides together. After I make sure everything is tight, then I install some cleats on the underneath side of the top. I apply glue to the cleats, and I also install screws into the horizontal rail and into the underneath side of the top. After connecting the frame, I then flip everything over so that my bookshelf is upright, and then I put in the bottom panel. I actually found the bottom panel was a little snug and I didn't leave too much room for tolerances. So I had to grab a rubber mallet to tap it into place. Once the bottom panel is in place, I then try to install the center panel. However, I find it easier to take the bookshelf down and put it on the ground, and then I install the center shelf and also the top shelf. It's at this point that I start to get happy, because I think this looks pretty good and I'm overall pleased with how it turned out. For the finish, I try to keep the natural color of cherry. So I apply a product by General Finishes that's pretty clear, but also has some UV protectant.
Thank you for watching today's video on the Craftsman style bookcase. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you in a future video real soon.